So moving to the second part of the interview, part two, the key theme here is about the method, which is what I've written here, and is engagement and radical transparency. And we can kind of maybe start with what that meant in regards to the board and how it kind of engaged, as we've already touched on in part one, but maybe a little bit more meat this time about engaging with outsiders.
Well, as we've said, I think it's extremely important for any corporation or business organization to listen to their critics and invite the critics in and say, what do you think about it? If you think, for example, very often we would consider that this was a misunderstanding, that they had not understood, and that they'd got the wrong impression. But if someone has a wrong impression, that's because you've given them the wrong impression. So it's very important to listen. What is their impression and why do they believe that? So I think it's important to be transparent. When I was dealing with some of these, whether it was Syria or China, I found it useful to talk to civil rights organization in a spirit of trust, because I said to them, what do you think we should be saying, for example, to the Chinese leadership? What's an important message that you as civil society would like to get across? And they said, well, we'd like to get across the ability of an individual to be legally represented, as it were, against the state. And I said to them, now, one of the issues here is that in many of these situations, it's just me and the head of state, maybe an interpreter. Nobody else is present. So the only report you have from it comes from me. And you have to trust that I am actually telling you the truth. And they said, no, we have no big difficulty with that. We're quite happy to think. And I said, on my side, I have to have trust that you're not going to go out and say publicly, we told Moody-Stuart to tell whoever the following, because that will destroy my position. And certainly I had an example once in Sudan about Amnesty came to us and said, we think that Shell is supplying helicopter gunships who in different parts of the country are committing human rights abuses. And I said, I'm fairly sure that we're not, but let me check and see. So I went and checked with the person representing Shell in Sudan, who was Sudanese, and said, Mohammed, do you think this is so? And he said, no, I'm sure it's not. But let me check. And he came back and he said, no, we're not we put fuel in the airport into all sorts of things, World Health Organization, World Food Organizations, but not into helicopter gunships. But he said, we do supply the government, and the government puts the fuel into barges, and they take it down to the south, and then they put it in helicopter gunships. So it fetches up there in the end. So I said to him, what do you think we should do? He said, well, we should stop. And we can actually do that. The government's always wanted this contract back, so we can hand the contract back over to the government. And I said to Amnesty, look, this doesn't ultimately solve the problem. It gets it out of our system. And it's important that you don't for the safety of our Sudanese employees that you don't make a big song and dance about it, which to their great credit, they didn't.
Thank you. And I think you've kind of touched on what was another part of the question about the brave CEO, but I don't know whether you have anything else that you'd like to kind of add to that in terms of what it means to be brave.
No, I think if you take, for example, the issue of climate change, both Shell and BP for the last 25, probably going on 30 years, have promoted carbon pricing, properly designed carbon prices schemes with a cap that's gradually lowered as the means of inducing transformation into the industry. So with a carbon price set at a level which forces real, through economic effects, forces real change. And I think that's an example of companies actually arguing for something which you might say is not in their best interest, but it's clearly in the interest of society. Now you could turn it around and say, well, it really is in their best interest because in the end, it allows a proper transformation. But I think it's that sort of thing where you need clarity of thinking.
Are there times when that can become, have you got any examples when that becomes difficult? I think the Quaker expression is to sort of, to hear the inner or the quiet voice, and having space to do that. But have you got any examples where you really struggled with what was the right path?
No, not directly. I think I mean, if you take going back to the example of Syria and Hafez al-Assad, I don't know his son, who I think is a different character. Not that Hafez al-Assad was any angel. He was certainly guilty of shelling a town called Hama, which he felt was a hotbed of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he was very scared of Islamic extremism. But with him, you could see that as liberalization took place, he took pleasure in liberalization, but was extremely cautious about the speed of it. He'd seen the Soviet Union collapse and he didn't want a similar collapse. So it was a question of how could you encourage faster transformation and not sink into an acceptance of the status quo. Because in fact, unless you are actually trying to change it, you're not doing one part of the job. One part is being an example. But the other part is actually to try and improve or change the system. And it can be too comfortable to simply think, we've got a good relationship, I can talk to the man, I actually enjoy it. Just that's good enough progress, but it's not really progress.
Yeah, the expression that comes to mind is a kind of, the burden of leadership is much greater than we kind of acknowledge. There's a lot of complexity, and there are trade-offs.
Yes. I mean, the question of whether you can maintain your own principles is the key one. Is the government or government activity making you do something which is not acceptable to you? And the closest I've come to that is in employment conditions, where in some countries, so-called permanent residents who are non-citizens, if you're not careful, are discriminated against. And most countries have legislation encouraging the employment of nationals rather than migrants. But in these cases, they're not migrants, they're actually permanent people who were born in the country but have just not achieved citizenship. So there can be some quite tricky situations like that.
So that ties back to what was said in part one, is that corporations can most certainly be a force of good. And in the short time that I've been talking to you, I've learned a great deal about how Shell and its later form was a force for good. And often I think the extraction, as it's now called, of the oil industry, extraction oil industry, has a really bad PR. But listening to you, there's a lot of good being done.
Well, I think I mean, throughout my career in the industry, I always felt that we had a noble purpose, as it were, which was to supply the much needed energy to those who did not have energy at an economic cost and without while minimizing environmental damage. Now we've learned as time went on in my case, from the mid-90s probably, that the actual combustion of, it's not just a question of local pollution, but actually the impact on climate of the combustion of our products has added an urgency to the problem. But the purpose hasn't changed. It's to supply the economic energy, reliable economic energy, to those who need it. It's just the energy needs to change, the form of energy.
Thank you.